If you want to restore law and order in this country, vote Trump. If you want to defeat the deep state, vote Trump.
Today we're discussing the deep state. This is a phrase that conjures all kinds of sinister images. It's the stuff of movies. It's the stuff of novels. By deep state, we simply mean a deeply embedded, unelected, permanent body of bureaucrats who are resistant to the will of the people and who, as my producer pointed out over here, protect themselves. That's what we're talking about when we refer to the deep state. In the case of what Donald Trump is doing currently, I don't know that there's any president who's ever tried to do it. And that is to root out this corruption, to root out those elements of the deep state, and to try to bring the United States government to heel, meaning to the heel of the will of the American people. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And today we're discussing the deep state. Yes, the deep state. This is a phrase that conjures all kinds of sinister images. It's the stuff of movies. It's the stuff of novels. And not just recently, but going back decades. You know, I think of the novel 6 Days of the Condor, which became the movie with Robert Redford and Cliff Robertson titled 3 Days of the Condor. And that whole thing was about the deep state within the state. I think there's a lot of confusion regarding what we mean by deep state, and hence the reason I wanted to address it in this particular episode of Ideas Have Consequences. First of all, I can't tell you exactly what every person who uses that phrase means, but I will tell you what I mean and what most conservatives mean when they use that phrase. By deep state, we simply mean, not some big conspiracy theory, we simply mean a deeply embedded, unelected, permanent body of bureaucrats who are resistant to the will of the people and who, as my producer pointed out over here, protect themselves. They protect each other. That's what we're talking about when we refer to the deep state, a deeply embedded, unelected, permanent bureaucracy that is against the will of the people and protects themselves. That's what we're talking about. So in the case of what Donald Trump is doing currently, you must understand that when we're talking about everything from Epstein lists, you know, all the way to USAID, to the Department of Education, to borders, the Department of Justice, all of that what Trump is trying to do, I don't know that there's any president who's ever tried to do it. And that is to root out this corruption, to root out those elements of the deep state, and to try to bring the United States government to heel, meaning to the heel of the will of the American people. That's what we mean. So the state itself has proved resistant. We see this increasingly as the decades, as the years roll by, that the state is resistant to the will of the people. It makes all kinds of promises, as politicians are prone to do, but without fulfilling hardly any of them. And that's because whatever president comes and goes, whatever congressmen come and go, whatever senators come and go, the state, the deep state, remains more or less constant. And it reproduces itself. And it continues in the direction that those who manage it want it to go. And by the way, I don't think there's any single individual who's running it. I don't think there's a group of people who meet, who manage it. I think that there are a myriad of agendas that are at play here, but all of them serving self-interest, all of them serving some form of greed, ideology, frequently anti-American, often even anti-human. And Donald Trump is trying to root out and destroy the deep state. But you got to understand, that's a process. That is a process, and not a process probably achieved in a single term. It's why it's going to be extremely important that whoever follows him, whether it's a J.D. Vance or whoever that may be, that it's an individual who's prepared, who has the courage, who has the guts to continue that fight. And by the way, I think that's one of the important aspects here is courage. I've been thinking an awful lot about courage, thinking about cowardice. Cowardice is probably the worst of all vices, and it's because by it, every virtue falls. Every virtue falls, and that's because for virtues to stand, it requires courage. And Trump, whatever you want to say about Donald Trump, and loads of people will come into the comments and say all sorts of things, Donald Trump is a man of courage. Anybody who has somebody try to blow his head off, gets up with his face bleeding and is saying, fight, 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 that's a guy who's got a set of cojones. And Donald Trump absolutely does, and he recognizes that the deep state is real, and he wants to root it out and destroy it, and thus restore America, or as his term, to make America great again. But you see, most presidents, most politicians, while knowing it's there, leave it alone. And they do so because they don't want their heads blown off. They do so because they themselves don't want to become, the targets of a deeply embedded, permanent, unelected body that has the power to destroy them. That's why. So this is what we mean when we're talking about the deep state. But let's just back up with some of the stuff that we've been talking about here on Ideas Have Consequences. And let me give you an example. I love this board. Let me give you an example of what we're talking about here. Just one example among many of what we mean by the deep state. So here is the United States government. United States government, USG, is what I mean here. And we have money, lots of it, flowing over to this body. And what is this body? USAID. If you are a member of the posse, if you are a fan of Ideas Have Consequences, you have heard me talk a lot about USAID and the corruption of USAID. Now, what we know is that USAID was receiving somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion, that we know of, $50 billion a year of taxpayer money. We also know that it was being used for a variety of ill purposes. We know that it's being used to fund terrorism. We know that it's being used to fund Naked Twister in Kenya. We know that it was being used for the mutilation of children, for abortion. We know that it's being used for open borders to facilitate the largest, as I've shown you on Ideas Have Consequences, the largest human trafficking operation in modern history. $50 billion. And when Musk and Doge came along and began pointing this out, that USAID was engaging in some of these kinds of activities. And by the way, I was arguing at that time, this was within the first couple of weeks of Trump's inauguration, that, we got an iceberg here, and that Doge was pointing out the tip of the iceberg. They were saying, hey, we've discovered that USAID is pretty corrupt. I mean, they're funding operatives and media against the American people. They were talking about money going to BBC and money going to Christianity Today and money going to all kinds of different media outlets. That was taxpayer money that wasn't immediately visible to the American people. In other words, it wasn't just NPR. Democrats were using USAID to fund their own propaganda machine. So when you wondered, I wonder if that guy's a paid operative. I wonder if Russell Moore over at Christianity Today is really offering what he thinks is his Christian worldview, or is he instead just a recipient of a lot of money and is just an operative? Well, it turns out he's just an operative. That's what was going on. But I was arguing at that time, they're missing Musk and his Doge team aren't aware that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that there was a lot more going below the surface. And that was when I was talking about, in a big way, what was happening with immigration, that they were funding a massive human trafficking op, all while pretending they weren't. They would take the public position that they were trying to stem the tide of migrants crossing our border, when in fact they were doing exactly the opposite and working in cahoots with Mexican and Colombian cartels to facilitate the movement of people towards the U.S. border. That's what was going on. And that's when, when I was on Bannon's show and I pointed this out, and Trump just happened to be watching and offered a nice attaboy when, because this was information he indicated during a commercial when he texted Steve Bannon to say, hey, this is stuff I didn't know. So, back to this. $50 billion a year, again, that we know of. So when Musk began pointing this out, you had members of our government, Democrats, people like, say, a Nancy Pelosi or a Chuck Schumer or an Adam Schiff, who were arguing, and then you started having George W. Bush coming along and saying, leave them alone. And you began seeing celebrities coming out and saying, leave them alone, leave USAID alone. And you even had people arguing. This to me is it's just absolutely incredible argument that they were making. They were arguing that, yeah, okay, we admit that there's very limited oversight with that $50 billion, but there really shouldn't be any oversight. I want you to think about that a minute. I mean, they were openly arguing that a U.S. government agency should have no oversight. So the President of the United States orders, and again, this is just an example for you of what the deep state looks like. The President of the United States issues an executive order saying USAID is to be shut down. What does the left do? They do what they always do. They immediately go to the courts because they want to do an end run on the will of the people. They want to neuter the President of the United States unless it's their president. And so they went to the courts, and temporarily Trump was ordered by a court that has no authority to do this, no constitutional authority to do this, to keep the tap open on USAID. But USAID is supposed to shut down. Well, what was USAID doing? Listen to what this African ambassador has to say here.
We need to understand the real reason why USAID is in Africa. And not just USAID, but other NGOs. You look at DFID, which is the British equivalent, and many other smaller ones. Their sole purpose was to act as if they're coming to rescue Africa. They're coming to fill in the gaps in government services, gaps in education, gaps in healthcare, gaps in humanitarian services. They're coming in the guise of addressing issues to do with human rights, issues to do with environmental protection and social justice. They are coming in claiming that they're introducing grassroots initiatives that are going to help the people. And so they use that as a way to go into the most remote parts of Africa. They're talking about government advocacy. When you look at it on paper, it all looks really good. But they're actually wolf in sheep's clothing. They are using that open access sounding humanitarian to constantly destabilize governments. I can tell you right now, the majority of African leaders, and not just African leaders, but leaders in the developing world, are celebrating the exit of USAID. I was listening to a program, I believe it was CNN, and I was jumping up and down. It was a government official from Hungary. He was echoing the same sentiments. He said they are happy USAID is leaving Hungary because they are always supporting opposition. Their form of government advocacy is supporting whoever can keep the government in a turmoil.
So, Ambassador, let me just jump in here for you. This is a message that I don't think many Americans hear. I think many Americans believe, not all of them, but many of them believe that AID was essentially set up for philanthropic reasons, for dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis, dealing with the various instabilities in the region, dealing with infrastructure deficits. But you're saying that there was something else as part of that package, meddling.
A major meddling agenda. Major meddling agenda. The majority of some of the workers, now the average USAID worker may not realize it, but quite a few of them are also operatives who are underground, and their major agenda is to destabilize governments, destabilize countries. If you think about it, their sole purpose, for example, filling in the gaps in healthcare and education, where is the change? Show me one country that USAID was in and education improved. Show me what country where USAID was in and healthcare improved. The social services they're bringing, it's peanuts. The American taxpayer needs to know the billions of dollars that are being given to USAID, a fraction is making it to the people.
So you heard that. If you can watch the full interview, what this woman has to say is actually explosive, because again, she is arguing that the deep state is real. She says it's real. And she's saying, and she's 100% correct, I can tell you this from, from personal observation, that what a USAID does is they do hire a lot of do-gooders. You may even know somebody who works for USAID and will say that everything I'm telling you is wrong. They hire a lot of young, naive types who would go and join the Peace Corps, you know, or the sorts that you find out in the streets, you know, arguing that we should have open borders or what have you, or free Palestine or some nonsense like that. They hire them to do the things that most people think USAID exists to do. USAID, again, is supposed to be the governmental equivalent of Samaritan's Purse. It's supposed to be a benevolence organization, USAID. And then the slogan from the American people. That's the argument. That's what they say that it is. So $50 billion goes over here, but where does that $50 billion go? Well, that $50 billion went to 25 different NGOs just to fund human trafficking, meaning there's way more than 25 NGOs that were being used. But again, because USAID is such a leviathan, and this is why I say not a single person, you know, runs it. We like to think, you know, Samantha Power is sitting at the top and she was the one, you know, who is managing all of this. No, USAID is a leviathan that has multiple agendas. It has multiple operators, and I think in some cases, U.S. government doesn't even have control over some offices. So again, shortly after I get that nice little attaboy from the President of the United States, I go to Cairo and I go to USAID. Now, some of you, the members of the posse, will remember what happened, and this is what happened.
What's he saying?
Stay here.
Hopefully I'm holding this up properly here, and they're, go ahead, you're fine. They're stopping my driver. They're telling me they want my phone because I have videoed the USAID facility and so forth. I've told them they can't have the phone. So now they're telling my driver he has to get out. So I'm continuing the video, and I can't see if I'm aiming this correctly, so hopefully I am.
So there you go. USAID security stops me. They had no jurisdiction to do that because they're rent-a-cops. They're paid with my taxpayer money, your taxpayer money, and they came out from beyond the barrier of USAID. In other words, the USAID compound is property, and they stepped into Cairo city limits proper, stopped my vehicle, surrounded the vehicle with weapons, told me that I couldn't leave, and if we did, they would fire on the vehicle, and they detained me for about 2.5 to 3 hours. First accusing me of terrorism and then accusing me of espionage. I freely admitted that I was a spy, not to spy on the Egyptian government, but to spy on the American government. And here's something I've not stated publicly before, at least I don't think I have, that occurred. And it's one of those things that, you know, when something like this happens, that's this big, that's this significant in your life, this type of event, you replay it in your mind, and sometimes details start coming back to you. And one of the things that happened deep into this, because bear in mind, many of you are aware of what happened at USAID Cairo, but for those who don't, very quickly, so USAID security stops me, but they realize they don't have any jurisdiction to do that, so they call Cairo police, they come, and harass me and are threatening. And then they call Egyptian state security, the so-called NSA. It has nothing to do with our NSA. They're the secret police. And their whole job is just to disappear people. That's what they do. They're trained by the KGB. And that's who they are. And they come and they say, we want your passport. We want you to get out of the car and you must surrender your phone. And I said, no, 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 I'm not budging. So then they turned to the driver and told him to drive it into the compound where they would be able to do whatever they wanted to me in secrecy because no one would be able to see it. And I told the driver, you're not moving the car. We're staying exactly where we are. And this was what was happening. Now, why was this happening? Because as I told them at the time, I'm simply here to see whether or not you are complying with the executive order of the President of the United States who's told you to shut down, and quite clearly, you haven't shut down. And being a bit of a smartass, I said this. This is the part that I haven't revealed publicly before. I said, guy said to me, why are you here? And I said, I'm here to see whether or not you shut down. I said, my president has sent me to see whether you've shut down. And the guy said to me, getting closer to my face, with malevolence and with anger. But I think he meant it. He said, my president has sent me to stop you. My president has sent me to stop you. I think he meant it. I think his president had literally sent him to stop me. Now, why is that? Now, think about this for a moment. This is a United States government. It's a federal agency. Why would the Egyptian president, Sisi, a general, why would he be so interested in stopping an American from reporting on the activities of an American agency? It wasn't an Egyptian one, it's an American one. Why would he be so interested in doing that? Well, I think the simple answer to that is because he's a beneficiary of what they're doing. And what are they doing? They're handing out billions of dollars, not just over here to 25 different NGOs to run a human trafficking operation through South America and into the United States, but because USAID, being the Leviathan that in some cases the federal government had no control over, and I'll explain to you how I know that in just a moment, what was happening in Africa is something altogether different, meaning the USAID operatives in Africa, they had no idea what's going on with USAID in South America. They didn't care. These are two separate agendas within the same organization. There are multiple agendas within, because it's deep state. It's deep state. And what USAID Cairo was up to, I suggest to you, they were using that office. I didn't see a single American when I was there. They were all Arabs, all Egyptians, and all incredibly nervous about what I might know. Incredibly nervous about what I might know. And that's because they were using this office as a forward operating base to run operations against Israel. I think Hamas is actually running it. So I leave there. The videos that I post online go viral. They go absolutely viral of some of what we've just shown you here. They go viral. And I get a call from someone very high in our government who asks me, Larry, what is going on at USAID Cairo? And I couldn't help but think to myself, isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that a member of the federal government is asking me, a person who is not a member of the federal government, what is going on at a federal government agency? And that's not because Trump is stupid. That's because at the time that this occurred, this was within the first month of Trump's presidency. He did not yet have complete control, and still doesn't, of the federal government, much less every federal agency, because the deep state is real. Because the deep state is real. Rooting all of that out, the resistance against the Trump agenda, the thing that I think Trump grossly underestimated in his first term was, imagine, it's hard to believe, but that a guy like Trump, I think we were all naive, Trump came to Washington believing that as a deal maker, as a businessman, that he could reorganize aspects of the federal government, make them more efficient, and he could stop the government waste, end the corruption, and truly make America great again. And then what he ran into was the deep state. He ran straight into the deep state that impeached him twice for nothing, that came up with and pushed a false Russia collusion narrative, that pushed lie after lie after lie, even within his own party, about what he was doing. And again, Trump realized the deep state was real. And something that I also think here that's very interesting and may have proved to have been to Trump's advantage, the deep state rigged the outcome of 2020. Tried to rig it in 2024 by trying to blow his head off. Now, do I think this kid was an operative of the left? I don't. I think that what they did was they created an atmosphere of assassination. You just spew hate constantly. You compare a guy to Hitler all the time, and there's going to be somebody who's going to think they're a hero by shooting him. That's what they wanted. They're still trying to create that, an atmosphere of assassination, an atmosphere of hate, an atmosphere to justify, to make a hero of an individual who goes and shoots the president. The same way the left has tried to make a hero out of this guy who shot the head of United Healthcare. That's what they've done. That's who they are. This time, why I think Trump not being president in 2 consecutive terms is because I think Trump has had 4 years to think on this. I think he's had time to realize how deep this corruption is and to begin trying to address it. Back to this. And by the way, I'm not saying that USAID is the only aspect of the deep state. I'm just using it as an example of the deep state. And I'm also using it as an example of maybe the most important arm of the deep state. It's why the left panicked when they saw that Trump was shutting this down. And it's because it's their cash cow. It's their cash cow. When Trump became president, Doge first started doing their work. Doge reported that 4.7 trillion, not billion, $4.7 trillion was unaccounted for. Now, I would suggest to you that is because Democrats were moving that money out in anticipation of possibly losing the election. They didn't know that they were going to lose the election, but just in case, they wanted to have a war chest. And then Trump comes along, he's told by Doge, he's told by me how corrupt this organization is and that they've got to destroy it, and he sets his sights on it. Now, do I believe it's currently fully destroyed? I don't. And not for lack of effort. I think that it's just that deeply embedded. And when you're talking about what's going on in Cairo, and of course I can't go back to Cairo because I'll find myself in some black hole where I'll never be seen or heard from again. They'll dump my body out in the desert or throw me in the Nile. They tried to do it. And I managed to get out of the country. But this is what I was trying to reveal to people. This is how corrupt this is. You know, one of the great lessons I learned in all of this, it's one of my great lessons, honestly, of maybe the last decade in my work. I realized that the President of the United States, that his power is overrated. We overestimate the power of the President of the United States. He is a powerful symbol, and he is indeed a powerful figure, but he is not all powerful. And while he can pick up a phone and move a fleet from one ocean to another, or he can fire an admiral or a general or appoint another one, or that he could take us into war. The President of the United States, for all of the military might that is available to him, all the satellites and drones and special forces and government agencies, at the end of the day, the President of the United States is still reliant on a few intrepid individuals like me and others who go places that other people aren't going to tell him what's going on. So that when I go to USAID or when I go to South America and I'm seeing what I'm seeing, that information is going straight to the president in some cases. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't it incredible that he didn't already know it? USAID is a picture of the deep state. It's a real picture of the deep state, and it's a picture of deep state corruption. And I'm just giving you a feeling that's in my bones. I haven't been out of the country for the last few months. I've been resting up and preparing for the next time that I go. But my feeling is that that aspects of this organization are still very much in operation. And I know a lot of you like to think that a figure like George Soros is really at bottom of the deep state. Just so you'll understand, George Soros is small potatoes. He might have established the pattern and the model. Maybe he established a beachhead for the advancement of a leftist agenda and ideology. But George Soros is worth roughly $8 billion. He doesn't have Elon Musk money. He doesn't have Bill Gates money. He doesn't have, who's the Amazon guy? Jeff Bezos money. He's nowhere, and he doesn't have USAID money. This is $50 billion a year that we know about. This is just the part that we know about. And again, what did the left argue? The left was arguing that they shouldn't have oversight. We really should leave them alone and let them do what they want. I mean, it's absolutely an insane argument from the left that, by the way, wants to know it has to be reported when you spend $600 or more on Venmo. They're arguing that they should be able to spend $50 billion with no one ever being able to ask any questions. And we know what they were doing with it. Funding human trafficking, funding terrorism, funding every sort of leftist agenda. This is an evil organization. But at the end of the day, what I'm really wanting you to understand, and this looks like a little turd pile that I put right here. I suppose I should, if I put a little swish on it, maybe it would really, make it look like that. But anyway, what I want you to understand is that the point isn't USAID per se. The point is the deep state. The point is the deep state. The point is that the deep state is real. Again, an unelected, deeply embedded, permanent bureaucracy that is resistant to the will of the people. That's what the deep state is. That's what we're talking about when we mean that. And that it survives from one administration to the next, to the next, to the next. And Trump is trying to bring it to heel. Trump is trying to reassert federal powers over it, the right federal powers, executive powers over it, that is itself subject to the will of the people. That's what he's trying to do. And the deep state is real, and it's going to take Trump, J.D. Vance, whoever the future president is, if he's got the guts to do it, it's going to take years in order to achieve it. So stay the course. Stay the course. The moment Trump was elected didn't mean that all suddenly America was great again. It's a process. It's a process, and it's a process that is brutal. It's a process that has pitfalls all along the way, perils all along the way, and I would suggest mortal danger all along the way, because you better believe that these are individuals who are out to protect their fiefdoms. They're out to protect their territory. They're out to protect that which they've stolen from the American people. And what is that? It's wealth and it's power. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.